Good afternoon, everybody, or whatever time it is in whatever part of the world you might be joining us today. My name is Professor Des O'Neill, Professor of Geriatric Medicine at Trinity College Dublin, and along with Anne Fuchs from the UCD Humanities Institute and Mary Cosgrove from the TCD Long Room Hub, delighted to welcome you to this welcome-funded seminar, part of a series on reframing aging. This is really a major attempt through scholarships to recapture the richness of aging that very often through the tropes and techniques of the various elements of gerontology may not fully achieve this richness. This is a really exciting interdisciplinary initiative. Our first webinar rendered a very, very interesting group of talks with equally interesting respondents, and we're really looking forward to a hugely interesting session today. So I'd like to hand you over to our researcher, Julia Langbein, who is chairing our first session. Julia.
So first speaker, Linda Shortt, Unfit Aging, the Aging Male in Hermann Kinder's Writing. Please take it away.
All right, so in this short paper today, I'd like to look at how Hermann Kinder represents the experience of aging in his writing. Now, although I had initially planned to explore this in at least two texts, because of time, I will in fact only focus on one. Now, Valerie, if you could just change the slide for me, please, thank you. It might be useful to give you a bit of background on Kinder before I begin. So Hermann Kinder is what might be considered a bit of a secret tip in German literary circles. Because despite his extensive publications list, he has actually been publishing since 1979, but his works have often, rather unfairly, stayed largely under the critical radar. In the past 20 years, he's published 3 literary works which are relevant for our purposes. So the fictional mother-son story, Leben und Tod, On Life and Death, which was published in 1997, the so-called Methuselah novel, Mein Melaten, which centers on an aging family father, a 20th century Methuselah and his friends, some of whom meet a Melaten graveyard in Cologne, and the fictional hybrid narrative, Der Weg allen Fleisches, The Way of All Flesh, an illness narrative which was published in 2014 and which I'll focus on today. Change the slide, please. In different ways, and the titles of these works will have already given this away, all 3 books explore the process of aging through the wider frame of what it means to be mortal, thematizing how people live a relationship to death at different stages of the life course. Now, Kinder is relentless in spotlighting what we might call the darker sides of aging, and themes that recur in his writing are illness, decline, and anxiety around death. While aging studies often tries to keep illness and aging separate to resist dominant social representations of aging and make clear that old age is not synonymous with failing health and redundancy, Kinder is actually preoccupied by this intersection. And this is perhaps because of his own personal situation. So the illnesses that feature in his writing echo his own illness career. But it's important to note that his works don't just conflate aging with illness and decline. Instead, Kinder seems to try to acknowledge the heterogeneity of experience, making space for other aging narratives. So, for example, those normally silenced by the discourse on successful aging developed by Rowan Kahn. Now, while successful aging eradicates the stereotypical narrative of age's physical decline by focusing exclusively on the positive aspects of aging, placing huge emphasis on the importance of the individual's health, behavior, and choices, Kinder pitches his narratives against this, focusing on the primary reality of the sick aging body. He flags up some of the limitations of the individual's ability to control their aging experience and makes clear that by applying the successful aging framework of living fully, healthily, and meaningfully, a framework which doesn't allow space for body concerns and physical and psychological issues around decline and death in aging, we actually run the risk of disadvantaging and excluding those who experience these. Now, this becomes particularly clear in The Way of All Flesh, which tells the story of Ka, a man who's in his late 50s when he's diagnosed with granulomatosis with polyangiitis, a disorder which inflames the blood vessels and then damages the organs. Over the course of the narrative, which spans several years, Ka experiences, amongst other things, respiratory, circulatory, heart problems, aneurysms, embolisms, a fatty liver, and retinal detachment. And although his prognosis is one of steady decline, this isn't presented as a failure at aging or indeed a failure at life. It's just a reflection of life's contingency, man's physiological makeup, and this particular illness trajectory. Now, in many ways, The Way of All Flesh is a subversive text, which doesn't try to transform illness into a redemptory or spiritual experience like many of the illness narrative types flagged up by Arthur Frank in The Wounded Storyteller. Instead, focusing on the body as a site, the book depicts the dissolution of a disciplined body self, outlining the reality of what it means to be living towards death, presented here as the way of all flesh. Death isn't sequestered off. It doesn't come at the end of a happy third age after a short, intense decline. Instead, Ka lives that which people tend to fear, a slow and painful decline in physical capabilities and functionality, which he is actually hyper aware of, but which he nonetheless feels compelled to try to survive. Switching between first and third person narrative styles, the book mobilizes traditional sociocultural scripts of masculinity that tend to sideline emotional distress by adopting a compact, laconic style. Even in the face of extreme bodily vulnerability and debilitation, so we get like graphic scenes of rapid gastric emptying and diminished mobility, Ka generally presents us with stoic resignation and falls back on humor to tackle more difficult topics, such as the loss of his forefoot, which is uncannily imagined at one point as an independent entity running along beside him. Now, the book contains a series of 12 drawings, and I'd like to focus on these here because they not only open, close, and punctuate the text, they also offer an alternative narrative voice. Marked by an economy of means, these drawings depict everyday scenes and experiences. They're largely in sync with the textual narrative, but they're more than just visual translations of the written word as they speak their own language. While the textual narrative uses techniques like foreshadowing to compress events and speed up the illness story and avoid sentimentality, the drawings slow things down, revealing levels of complexity and emotion that the text deliberately masks. They interrupt the flow and direct the reader's eye to particular moments, using distortion and ambivalences to encourage a meditation on the male body so we can observe how it comes undone. This is not a cool or rational medical gaze. The body depicted here is not a body to be envied or emulated. By exaggerating features and distorting proportions, the drawings make the physical and psychic body visible. The arc of the series is one of decline. It starts with a portrait of the self, and you can see that here, with the body largely intact. Although the figure displays generic signs of aging, gray hair and wrinkles, the body disappeared under a black top is not yet demanding attention, even if we can see the early signs of illness in the redness of the face. If you could just change the slides. This changes in later drawings where the body is displayed naked and vulnerable and leaking body fluids. It's presented as slug-like at times. So you can see here in the first drawing, the head sinks into the body, blurring the boundaries between body parts and giving it a shapeless form. When we look at how the figure is portrayed in the series, with sagging folds of flesh cascading downwards on both face and posterior, reflecting perhaps the increasing weight of gravity, which seems to almost drag Ka downwards to the floor, it seems that the grotesque is invoked offensively and defensively. On the one hand, it's used to create anxiety around unreliable bodies. On the other, through the use of the comic, the grotesque actually defeats anxiety by making it amusing. And we see this in Ka's transformation. Similar to Aschenbach in Death in Venice, at the beginning of the text, Ka encounters an old man whose physical form repulses him. The encounter condenses Ka's early attitudes to aging and death. He's bored by the old man's reminiscences and disgusted by the space that his excessive and transgressive old body takes up. And Ka resolves to live old age differently. He visualizes an old age tearing around the Swiss Alps on his bicycle, enjoying the landscape and the exercise, as well as the thrill of outperforming other hobby cyclists. And this personal ideal of an aging but still fit and competitive manhood is connected to what Calasanti and Slevin called doing. So that means performing in ways that seem appropriate. It's an anticipatory fantasy of growing chronologically older without aging, and it reflects his anxiety and fear of aging. And it's precisely this possibility of an imagined old age that he can control, which is nullified by illness. Unable to exercise and bloated from his medication, Ka becomes the antithesis of his old age ideal. He is now the excessive body that spills over in waves, for whom cycling is only a remembered activity. Now, in general, both the text and the drawings force the reader to confront aspects of illness and aging which normally remain unseen, and this includes invisible structural forms from architecture to advertising that exclude aging and impaired bodies, but also the aging body itself, which is normally covered, as well as the amputated foot stump. Hidden in his shoe, this is the unseen cause of his rolling gait and off-balance stance, which outsiders observe but cannot explain. And in the drawings, you can see the stump is presented for examination. We also see Ka's fears of death made concrete as his leg rests on a black scythe that extends to wrap around his swollen body, almost enveloping him with a fleshy death skull stump. And if you just change the slide here, these signs of decay actually stand in contrast to the image of Ka's post-operative body, which is hooked up to a series of heavy weights, which he's unable to lift. Comically lifted into the air with a chair underneath, his sporting efforts are not a way of empowering the body. Instead, this bodywork confirms his incapacity. If successful aging praises sport as a way of taking control of one's health and reshaping the body to extend the life course through good pain, this drawing shows Ka's attempts to be a good patient to try and abet his recovery and extend his life, but these efforts are futile, and the pain he feels will not improve his condition. In the final drawing, which we can see here, it's number 3 on this slide, the illness which normally wreaks destruction under the surface of the skin breaks out. And we see the body organs and fluids leaving this fleshy sinking ship, escaping out to take up space in the public sphere. This is a representation of the crisis of the body, but also a depiction of what Kathleen Woodward refers to as the fear of the fragmenting body and aging, which Ka is actually living. Hovering suspended while still attached, even the ambiguity of the organ on display, is it a stomach, is it a tongue, challenges any notion of bodily integrity. The catheter and oxygen tubes draw attention to medical procedures to extend life, but the body itself appears monstrous. An impression which is reinforced by the horn-like tubes that dominate his red and swollen face and the yawning dark hole of the mouth, which appears as the entrance to the site of illness, and which appears to be laughing. Only some organs are shown reflecting the felt anatomy, so the grayed out misshapen lungs here reflect their diminished capacity. The surgical scars on his legs and churned out foot draw attention to the amputated foot stump. This is a body which is in the process of exceeding its confines. It sags, it leaks. In its depiction of an anatomy of decline, the drawing draws attention to both the painful process of staying alive and the process of dying, which is already underway, leaving the reader in no doubt that, as the Benini quote which precedes it states, dying is the last thing that Ka will do. By placing this image at the end of the text, Kinder seems to deliberately undercut the viewer's emotional response to his protagonist's plight. Ka is not presented as particularly heroic or tragic here, he just is. We see him clinging to life, as the last line of the text states, immer in Erwartung des Unabsehbaren, so always in expectation of the unforeseeable. To bring this to a close then, Ka's experience of unfit aging is not just a becoming aware of the body, but a sense of being overwhelmed by bodiliness. This reshaped body, as the drawings make clear, is something which he is deeply ashamed of, but which he needs to actually keep going. This is a body which is no longer under his control, and it's the interplay of the text and image which allows the reader to gain a more nuanced understanding of what this looks like and what this feels like. Thank you very much.
Okay, fantastic. That was not only fantastic, it was perfectly on time. Well done. Everyone be like Linda. Next, Anna Fuchs, From Positive Aging to Anti-Ableism, Elizabeth Strout's Olive again.
Thanks very much, Linda. That is a terrific paper, and I'm looking forward to discussing it later on, and I think there's a degree of overlap. Okay. In the following paper, I want to discuss episodes of incapacitation, Elizabeth Strout's 2019 novel, Olive Again, the sequel to Olive Kitteridge, which was published in 2008. Strout's first novel is characterized by an ethnographic perspective which explores the aging experience in a small fictional town in Maine. By constantly shifting the narrative perspective from the protagonist onto other characters who inhabit the same community, Olive Kitteridge delves into the collective stigmatization of older women by means of the gendered and ageist, youthful structure of the look, to use Kathleen Woodward's term. The later novel then shifts emphasis onto the difficult transition from the third age to the fourth age. Strout's skillful point-of-view narration tracks the protagonist's emotional, physical, and psychological adaptation to and acceptance of her dependency on others. Let me say a few words about how I intend to reframe aging in this paper. Adopting a largely post-humanist optic, I will attempt to show how Strout's novel gestures towards an anti-ableist ethics and politics of relationality as an alternative to the prevailing model of successful aging, which we've already mentioned, as championed by the MacArthur Foundation and the United States and elsewhere. According to Sarah Lamb and her co-authors, since the 1980s, successful aging has persisted as the dominant paradigm in gerontological research. The idea of successful aging challenged the decline model of aging by turning aging into a project of self-maintenance. The burgeoning popular literature in this field, and I've just made a pretty arbitrary selection, often adopts a step approach promising the extension of the third age or a return to an earlier biological stage by means of a biopsychological regime of discipline and action. Rowan Kahn provided the gerontological underpinning by defining successful aging along the following lines. To succeed in something requires more than falling into it. It means having desired it, planned it, worked for it. All these factors are critical to our view of aging, which, even in this era of human genetics, we regard as largely under the control of the individual. In short, successful aging is dependent on individual choices and effort. Evidently, the author's emphatic promotion of individual choice, agency, and responsibility reveals a neoliberal investment in the autonomous, resilient, and entrepreneurial self. The implied flip side of the successful aging model is, of course, the unpalatable idea of unsuccessful aging. So what is unsuccessful aging? It captures the individual's failure to manage the maintenance of their bodily and mental capacities. Marked by high dependency and economic costs, unsuccessful aging connotes an incapacitated life that has been rendered unproductive and as such worthless at the threshold of death. By turning aging into a project for the empowered individual rather than for society as a whole, the successful aging model replicates the neoliberal equation of the value of life with agency, cognition, and purpose. It also supports the exponentially growing market of costly and privatized regenerative medicine and technology, while strategically downplaying ethnicity, gender, class, and income as significant factors influencing access to good aging. As Berridge and Martison have pointed out, this aging model is a classic example of ableism, which they define as, I quote, discrimination and prejudice against people with disabilities based on the assumptions of inferiority, abnormality, or diminished humanity, rather than understanding disability as a dimension of difference or another way for a body and mind to be. In order to mobilize an anti-ableist position against this paradigm, I want to draw on the disability scholar Yoon-Jung Kim's article on Unbecoming Human, which explores the possibility of a non-anthropocentric ethics that overcomes the exclusionary configurations of humanity. Probing the very conditions attached to the notion of humanness, Kim challenges the ableist grounds for exclusion based on capability, rehabilitation, and productivity. Instead, Kim suggests that unbecoming human by embodying objecthood, surrendering agency, and practicing powerlessness may open up an anti-ableism, anti-violence, queer ethics of proximity that reveals the workings of the boundary of the human. She further argues that the moments of object becoming yield an opportunity, one that is perhaps counterintuitive yet potentially generative, to fashion an ethics of non-purposive existence. For Kim, then, the aim of such an inhumanist vision is not merely a more inclusive understanding of humanness, but the disavowal of declarations of value of life. Now I'm going to turn to Elizabeth Strout's novel Olive again, which contains a series of highly charged moments of bodily objectification in which the protagonists surrender their agency and subject identities. A rather witty example occurs when Olive is visiting Jack during their courtship period. As Jack is telling Olive about his estrangement from his lesbian daughter, he's looking down at his socks, I quote, which made Olive look down at them as well, and she was surprised to see his toe sticking out of a hole in one. His toenail needed to be cut. God, that's unattractive, he said. Erotic titillation and phallic desire are replaced here by the objectified perception of a small but unduly obtrusive body part. Obviously, Jack's big toe sticking out of a hole in his sock is a comical symbol of diminished phallic power. The objectified perception of his unbecoming toe and nail stages a moment of unbecoming human in Kim's sense, which prepares the ground for a new form of intimacy based on a recognition of mutual need. Later on, the toenail scene is expanded when Jack finds Olive in the bedroom with tears running down her face because she can no longer bend down to cut her toenails. I quote, "She is too big and too old to get her feet close enough to her, and she just hated having her toenails so awful looking." For Olive, her awful looking toenails, which are beyond her reach, symbolize the progressive incapacitation of her body. Here, the moment of object becoming is encoded as utterly abject. However, when Jack takes her for a pedicure, Olive emerges with a smile on her face. I quote, "She rubbed my calves, oh, it felt good, massaged, that's the word, she massaged my calves, lovely," end of quote. The shared experience of anti-ableist care for the other then gives rise to a new choreography of intimacy, which takes the place of heterosexual desire. And I'm just going to quote the end of this. "The first months they had slept holding each other. Olive would put her leg over both his, she would put her head on his chest, and during the night they would shift, but always they were holding each other, and Jack thought of their large bodies shipwrecked, thrown up upon the shore, and they held on for dear life." Jack's focalization of the image of their large shipwrecked bodies accentuates the extent to which Jack, the proverbial white Western male, has embraced the inhumanist vision of non-purposive life. While these scenes foreground shared moments of unbecoming human, my next example concerns the episode where Olive has a fall. It is a life-changing moment which signals the transition towards the fourth age and institutional care. It is triggered when Olive finds a cigarette butt on the porch of her house and tries to pick it up. Strout's point of view narration is extremely detailed and alternates between Olive's perception of her immobilized body, which is exposed to the elements, and her fear of dying alone. Unable to lift herself up, she experiences her body as an alienated entity that she can no longer control. Linguistic instructions to herself are meant to regain bodily mastery, and that's the second paragraph in this long quote, which I will not read out. Eventually, she manages to hoist herself up by getting hold of a watering tap. And I will read this quote. "Inch by half inch, Olive was able to move her body by thrusting it again and again until she could reach the spigot. She kept trying to reach the spigot and she kept falling short. But then she finally got her hand around it, and by God, if it didn't help. It stayed steady, the spigot, and she was able, by holding it, to get herself to a sitting position. And then she turned and knelt. And then she put her hands on the arms of the chair and she finally stood." Even though Olive eventually does manage to get herself off the ground, the fall episode marks a shift from the capacity-based definition of being human to a post-humanist understanding of entangled existence. From an intertextual angle, the description of Olive's physical incapacitation echoes Kafka's Metamorphosis, a seminal post-humanist text which delves into unbecoming human through the metamorphosis of the principal character into Big Bug. So let's have a brief look at Gregor's struggles to get up. He would have needed arms and hands with which to get up, instead of which all he had were those numerous little legs, forever in varied movement and evidently not under his control. If he wanted to bend one of them, then it was certain that that was the one that was next fully extended. And once he finally succeeded in performing whatever task he had set himself with that leg, then all its neglected fellows would be in a turmoil of painful agitation. Gregor's insect body has a life of its own. Once it is animated, it eschews discipline and governance. The uncontrollable movement of his numerous little legs, which have a mind of their own, not only annuls the hierarchy between mind and body, but it also dispels the fantasy of bodily integrity and coherence. Kafka's story responds to disastrous effects of the Cartesian conception of the subjects and the racialized modern biopolitics by means of the powerful image of the transformation of the Western male subject into vermin. That is a quote from the text. That is a form of life which, according to modern biopolitics, is useless and justifies containment and ultimately extermination. Strout shares with Kafka an interest in the non-profitable body. And so it is that both Gregor Samsa and Olive Kitteridge experience a radical split between their cognitive function and the rebellious bodies which no longer obey the biopolitics of self-control. Both episodes not only unsettle the cultural association of embodiment with able-bodiedness, but they also challenge the very idea that dignity is a condition of humanness. Afterwards, Olive is, however, overcome by a consuming sense of Gothic terror in Jack's empty house. Everyday objects now exude an uncanny anismy, which frightens Olive precisely because it unsettles the conventional divisions between life and death, dynamism and stasis, and mobility and immobility. Surrounded by a gaping, bright universe of loneliness, she sees herself in the image of a mobile object whose wheels are falling off. I quote, "She realized it was as though she had all her life 4 big wheels beneath her, without ever knowing it, of course, and now they were all 4 of them wobbling and about to come off. She did not know who she was or what would happen to her." It is, of course, no coincidence that Olive conjures up the single most iconic image of 20th century speed politics and mobility, the motor car. While Filippo Marinetti's futurist manifesto celebrated the car crash as a supreme moment of liberating rupture, the wheels falling off Olive's aging body demarcate the end of the modern fantasy of progress, agency, and control over the future. In the light of these threatening experiences, Olive reluctantly acquiesces when her son signs her up for the Maple Tree residential care home without having consulted her. But Strout's book ends on a positive note, with Olive writing her memoirs and striking up a friendship with Isabelle Dagner, a French-Canadian woman. The final lines point to an anti-ableist self-perception which is open to otherness, including the otherness of death. I quote, "I do not have a clue who I have been. Truthfully, I do not understand a thing." Olive stuck her cane to the ground and hoisted herself up. It was time to go get Isabel for supper. Thank you.
Okay, that was wonderful, and also I think really exemplary in the way that you situated your reading across disciplines really clearly for all of us. And finally, Mary Cosgrove, The Meaning of Middle Age in Contemporary German Literature.
Thanks, Julia. So I'm just going to speak. I don't have any slides, but there are some overlaps most certainly with both Anna and Linda's papers. I'm going to be reflecting on a trilogy of midlife novels that was published in Germany between 2009 and 2019. And through the course of the paper, I'm going to consider how these novels, this trilogy, implots the course of midlife. And then I'm going to offer some ideas on what this implotment might be able to tell us about the status of midlife currently in one of the Western world's richest and most educated societies. So while thinking my way towards this paper, I sort of realized, I suppose, that a book-length study on representations of midlife in contemporary German fiction would be an immensely worthwhile project. So first of all, with a median age of 45.7 years, Germany is solidly middle-aged. And second, with a death rate that outstrips its birth rate, its population is in decline, and it's also aging. Germans are living longer. They have quite a high life expectancy for men and women. Third is also how in contemporary German literature, middle age is a prism through which to angle the experience of socio-historical events, and with that to express a particular temporal sensibility of perplexity and bewilderment. And I think you could say a lot about that, but it's fairly complicated, I think. It's a general insight, of course, and it won't be limited to German letters alone. Other literatures and cultures will invariably employ middle age and other life stages and ages in representative works to frame local or national concerns that may also have a resonance with world historical or global developments. However, given Germany's prominent place at the coalface of 20th century history, age, whether implicitly or explicitly, is always a political matter. The question of when you were born, so for example, 1945 or 1989, and where, meaning in which Germany, West Germany, the GDR, or the unified nation, and of course, when you were born can determine where you were born as well. These questions permeate much contemporary German writing, not least those texts that deal with Germany's recent difficult pasts. Middle-aged Germans today will have been born between, roughly speaking, 1960 to 1975, which means that some were born and socialized in the East, while others were born in the West. So for example, I was just spinning this out in my head. If you were an East German of, let's say, 30, when the wall came down, you might have ended up in long-term unemployment. You might not have, but you might have. An experience of accelerated decline where unification, so full of promise initially, was in reality the transition to socioeconomic irrelevance before your time. We could describe this political and historical experience of rapid reunification as the lived temporality of premature aging. Post-unification literature from the East German perspective often expresses this. What I mean to say with this example is that many middle-aged East Germans today may subjectively feel, and I don't know if this is actually the case, but it would be an interesting question, they may subjectively feel that they've been in their middle years for over 2 decades now. And this is, of course, a negative reading of middle age in terms of decline that emphasizes the individual as a socioeconomic entity above all else. So these are just some opening thoughts that resonate to an extent with the trilogy I've chosen to speak about today. I'll be presenting the work of Teresia Mora, who was born in 1971, a Hungarian-German writer who's been resident in Berlin since the 1980s, and she's one of Germany's leading authors today. I mention her birth rate because the trilogy features a protagonist who's roughly the same age as the author. The 3 novels appeared respectively in 2009, 2013, and 2019, and trace the midlife trajectory of a character called Darius Kopp, who, when we meet him in the first novel, The Only Man Left on the Continent, is 43, balding, and rotund. By the end of the third novel, On the Rope, Kopp is 50, he's still balding, and having lost some weight in the intervening years, it's beginning to return. He's beginning to return to his original rotund form. The pounds are creeping back on again. His story spans the period between 2008 and 2014. So I'm going to be trying to assess whether Kopp's narrative is a narrative of middle age as decline and disappointment, or whether Mora presents a more nuanced account of middle age as a development narrative, maybe even with some progress in it. When we meet Darius Kopp, he's an IT wireless security engineer based in Berlin, working for a global conglomerate which has its headquarters in Sunnyvale, California. It's late August, early September 2008. The Lehman Brothers crash is on the horizon, and with that, the rapid descent into the global financial crash of 2008-9. Kopp is 43, as I said, and already at this point, he has considerable experience of the precarity of his sector. During the dot-com crash of 2000, he lost his job and all his investments, remaining unemployed for a year, but eventually finding steady enough work in what Mora presents as an unpredictable, constantly flexibilizing sector characterized by sudden takeovers and mergers. A first insight then is a generally relevant one, but it applies with force to this trilogy. If you work in this sector, you must constantly self-optimize and self-manage. Indeed, behave as though you are an entrepreneur as opposed to a salaried employee. Self-improvement, self-discipline, and constant striving is the name of the game. Flexibility, adaptability, a willingness to learn, and so on. The so-called entrepreneurial self is a product of the flexibilized, globalized workplace that puts ever greater responsibility on the shoulders of its workers, even while reducing or completely discontinuing securities and benefits. To some extent, Mora presents this environment as a young person's milieu, and indeed Kopp was once upon a time that younger person, a 24-year-old ready for anything back in 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell and the East opened up. Originally from the GDR, Kopp wholeheartedly embraced capitalism, entering the 1990s, that holiday decade of decadence parties, fun and easy money, by getting his first job in a US company with an office in Berlin. Around the turn into the millennium, the crises start to occur and never seem to cease for very long. In the dot-com crash, the unemployed Kopp marries a Hungarian woman called Flora, who's trying to get by in Berlin by working in media and translation, supplementing this bid for a career with jobs in cafes and bars. Kopp and Flora get married after her first suicide attempt and depressive stint in hospital. They then spend several years unsuccessfully trying to conceive. At the start of the first novel in the trilogy, this is where the couple is at in their life, struggling to stay afloat in a precarious, white-collar middle age, with little financial or job security, several personal problems, and no clear solutions in sight. By the end of that first novel, Kopp has lost his job again, and Flora has left him, moving to an eco-friendly commune on the outskirts of Berlin. At the start of the second novel, we learn that Flora committed suicide a matter of weeks after the end of the first novel. The second installment of the trilogy narrates Kopp's grief as he goes on an extended road trip with Flora's ashes in an effort to find the right place to bury her remains. And at the start of the third and final novel, we find out that this last resting place is Mount Etna on the island of Sicily. Kopp, now approaching 50, has been living here and working in a pizzeria for the last number of years, having completely dropped out of his white-collar global IT lifestyle. No one in Berlin knows where he is, so in effect, he's been hiding for many years. On the face of it, this trilogy seems to implot middle age in a narrative of decline, failure, and tragedy. In his 40s, Kopp loses everything. And by the end of the final novel, materially, he hasn't won very much back, even though he does return to Berlin. The global financial crisis thus maps onto his midlife crisis. Both invariably have the end of the Cold War as part of their origin story. Kopp slams the door on the GDR with the fall of the wall, only too glad to be rid of that place of deprivation, embracing capitalism with wild abandon. And Mora paints the economic crisis in terms of the heady, unbridled ascent of global neoliberal capitalism after 1989. In the final novel, it's clear that neoliberalism has weathered its catastrophic failure of 2008 and continues to flourish unscathed, while loser Kopp, the erstwhile successful neoliberal subject, must find a way to arrange himself within this mindless socioeconomic formation. And this he does by accepting downward social mobility and casual precarious work as inevitable features of life in such a system. In so doing, he is, of course, no less a neoliberal subject than when he was a well-paid IT engineer. It's just that now he more evidently belongs to a new underclass of highly qualified and experienced precarious neoliberal subjects. This seems to be anything but a progress narrative of middle age. Well-educated, professional class midlife characters should not end up in near destitution, widowed in the most traumatic way, with no fixed abode and a completely ruptured career path. And yet I would argue that Mora's trilogy, while in some respects very clearly a story of failure and decline, it's also from the start a story of resilience, that in exposing the ugly realities of today's greater socioeconomic picture, shows how people can and do reinvent themselves beyond the mindless self-optimization of the neoliberal, of the entrepreneurial self, because they must. Mora tells the story of the resilience of middle age through Kopp's very body. It's not a perfect, fit, or even youthful body, but it's strong and robust. It is a body that endures. It never stops consuming in order to keep itself going. Kopp continually eats and drinks the whole way throughout this trilogy. It's also a body that sleeps when it needs to and parties when it can. In short, it's a body that can adapt to the temporal vicissitudes of 24/7 neoliberal capitalism, even if this means hangovers and exhaustion, along with sudden fits of deep sleep during the working day that alternate with insomnia and restlessness at night. Kopp's bodily presence is constant in this trilogy, the base persistence of his body in the face of personal trauma, the caprice of the global IT sector, and the pathological effects of obscure capitalist temporality, tells a story of middle aging as mental and physical survival by whatever means and no matter what. Sometimes survival takes the form of marathon drinking sessions and deliberately not working. This is quite subversive when we think of compliant neoliberal subjecthood, such as the entrepreneurial self. And it's also subversive that this non-compliant behavior is placed in the lap of a midlife character. Other times, particularly in the final novel of the trilogy, this resilience comes across as a quiet asceticism and withdrawal, which we might align with mature processing and acceptance of life's tragedies. Whichever form Kopp's doggedly surviving body takes, its central place in the narrative makes his story one of resilience, even while it is also a story of disappointment, failure, and decline. To come back to one question I asked at the start, what can this tale of tempered resilience tell us about the status of midlife in contemporary Germany? Well, I mean, I don't really know, but I'll offer a couple of thoughts. Placing Kopp's body at the center of a middle-age narrative is a way of conducting an acerbic critique of wealthy German society. Kopp's story tells us that even as a privileged, educated, white European man, by middle age, you may have nothing much to show for your labor in an economic context characterized by growing inequalities and the erosion of the middle class. Kopp's story of tempered resilience, which resists the idea of decline that perhaps goes a little bit too easily with middle age, takes place in the greater context of regressive modernity and downward social mobility, the opposite of the progress narrative of upward social mobility that informed the 3 decades after the end of the Second World War. This is a global phenomenon. It's far bigger than any one individual, generation, or polity. Mora's account of Kopp's middle age tells us this. In precarious times, the individual is thrown back onto their body. They are perhaps more evidently a body than at other times. The truth of a biopolitical economic subjectivity comes to the fore here. Irrespective of whether you stay in the game as a compliant entrepreneurial self or whether you burn out and drop out, one way or the other, you are very close in some respects to your 19th century predecessors, in that it is blatantly clear that what you have is your labor, the work your body can do, IT security or flipping pizzas, to sell in a precarious market. Being a biopolitical body in a neoliberal context is not restricted to people in middle age, of course, but by making this story the story of a middle-aged man, Mora undermines the economic progress narrative of upward social mobility. This is no straightforward tale of the regressive middle-aged subject in a wider hegemonic context of regressive modernity, however. Mora's trilogy instead offers an alternative narrative of resilience within and despite the overall regressive context. Thank you.
Great, fantastic. Yeah, thank you so much. I was thinking after the first two talks that what we needed to link them was a consideration of their relative historical positions of the texts, and then that's exactly where you went, Mary. So that was great. I think the idea now is to turn the discussion over to our respondents, Katie Featherstone and David Troyansky, who will give us some talking points, maybe kind of launch the discussion in a particular direction, and then everybody will be open to participate. So Katie and David, I don't know who wants to start.
It was such a privilege to read all these papers yesterday in detail and to think about them. I thought they were just so wonderful. It was exactly what I needed in such a sad environment to really get me thinking about work as well. And I'm not sure about setting off the discussion in a particular way, but it made me, I thought they just came together so well. And I think what I really want to say is, in response to these papers, is the way in which these narratives and the analysis presented really help us to access the inner worlds of people and the context of experience of aging over time. But they also, as mentioned, help us to examine them in the broader social and political context and how they impact on success, on the individual, the aging individual. As an empirical researcher carrying out detailed ethnography exploring hospital care for people living with dementia, that sounds like a very specific aspect of aging, but actually my observation extends to exploring the care of older people, because one thing is really interesting is that hospital institutional understandings and recognition of aging in their patient population really can be seen in this very narrow way. Aging is seen as, there's a long-standing hospital practice of grading patients by age and ability. So we have wards designed for the elderly, the frail, the dementia-friendly. And what that means is there are signage, there's bright decor, day rooms all refurbished to reflect the 1940s and 50s, using styles of kind of false fireplaces and equipment in retro castings. But this also bring to mind the aging person as one who longs for nostalgia for a presumed golden age, an era really not experienced, if at all, by the contemporary older person or older patient. So in the hospital, the older patient kicks in at 65. That's the kind of the categorization. But these interventions, we can see that actually they see them as a group who are in their 90s, who are somehow hark back to the Second World War and that kind of this kind of halcyon age of the 50s. So it's really interesting that that's the limit of their understandings. And I thought all of these presentations really got to the heart of what I see in the kind of the ordinary, repetitive, mundane and often invisible care experienced by lots of older people. It's incredibly invisible, and these presentations just so beautifully touched on continence care in Kinder's drawing of catheterization. It was so visceral, but also absolutely got to that heart of it. Being overwhelmed by the body, the falling or having falls, the olive experiences of falling, the toenails, and the experience of dependency on others, and that individual trajectory of decline that we've just heard, I think are so beautiful, that wider socioeconomic and personal decline within the German context. And as an empirical researcher, actually, these perspectives are so important, but they're very rare to actually, that we see in the kind of empirical research that I do in sociology and across nursing. And I think that's why they also feel quite subversive. They're quite, these are silent perspectives, but also often very hard to articulate. My final point, I think, is, I think what's so subversive and so important is that they challenge the cultural ideals, the fantasy of successful aging and progress narratives, and that these perspectives feel more reflective of the people I meet and the experience of aging I witness in hospitals in my research. As Linda calls it, the darker side of aging, or as Anne puts it, when the wheels fall off the aging body, but also, as Mary reminds us, the quiet resilience. And I think that is, I suppose, my call for, actually, that's what we need to look at as academics, is these hidden darker sides of aging that are very, very much silenced by these wider cultural pressures of how to age.
It reminds me of
done.
Beautiful, very, very useful. And it's interesting to me that as an empirical researcher, you find these darker, so to speak, darker narratives actually to be uplifting, or somehow, as if, pessimism is the optimism of the smart, as they say. So
it's getting to real life, and I think that's these narratives actually do reflect so well. Yeah, but I'll zip it.
Okay, and David.
Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed these papers. They were all terrific, and they were amazingly coherent in this panel. But good to see Anne and Valerie and Des and Julia from 2 years ago in Dublin, and wish I could be there, wish we could all be there. I understood that I was to talk a little bit about my disciplinary perspective on these papers. And so I'm a historian. And so maybe I read texts and texts on literature a little differently. I happen to write something on this that's coming out in May in a book, and I'll shamelessly include this in the chat. But it's a book called Cultural Histories of Aging, Myths, Plots, and Metaphors of Senescence, edited by Marjorie Weib-Skagen at the University of Bergen. And it looks horribly expensive, so I hope libraries will be able to purchase it. But I have a thing in there on using literary sources in a world history of aging. And just to crib for myself very briefly, I talked about 3 different ways in which historians of aging have used literary sources. One, as exemplary or merely illustrative material. Another, analyzing the evolution of literary tropes and genres in a kind of serial fashion to look at continuity and change. And then as clues to past subjectivities and emotions. And I find those different approaches useful in reading these papers and in hearing these papers. So at the most basic level, the simple sort of illustrative or exemplary, what do these aged characters look like? How do they act? How are they treated? What plot devices juxtapose old and young? And what ideals or vices are embodied in aging characters. On the literary tropes and genres, our papers have occasionally hinted at this. Surely decline narratives have some kind of history themselves. And so it'd be interesting to think about how the decline narratives that are being criticized in the papers fit in a larger sort of historical scheme. Do characters in recent literature struggle against ideas of character as moral exemplar or caricature? And finally, subjectivities and emotions, I'd be interested in how one emotional regime gives way historically to another. But there are also very basic literary questions that should concern us, like dealing with first person or third person narrative. And I think a historian would ask about whether we're dealing with the aging author's sense of self or temporality, and so forth. So just to say something about each paper. In Linda Shortt's paper on Hermann Kinder and The Way of All Flesh, we have this 2014 illness narrative with illness, decline, anxiety, and what she calls, and Katie referred to this as well, the darker sides of aging. And there is this interesting blend of first and third person narratives of sort of intimacy and distance, and the relationship between text and image. I thought it was really interesting when Linda on page 4 writes that Ka resolves to live old age differently, but it is precisely this possibility of a certain kind of life, his personal imaginary of his own old age, which is nullified by illness. And so I was thinking of the relationship between that personal imaginary and the more social imaginary. And that's where a historian like me would want to enter into this. We have this character imagining himself healthy, riding a bicycle and so on. And there's the play of the sort of cultural stereotypes and advertising about old age and commodification of old age and so on. And then there's the personal. There's a lot of intertextual stuff going on in this paper, I think. The references to Kafka, to Mann, I think maybe Samuel Butler, I don't know. But I thought of late novels of Philip Roth, The Aging Male. For me, the depiction of bodily decline evokes a long tradition of representations, going back to antiquity, going through maybe early modern sermonizing. And in all of those representations, there's this way in which the body points to other things. Look not at the body, look at the soul. Old versus young, or control the body. Sorry,
David, just in order to have a little time for discussion, I'm sorry, I should have been clearer, but about the timing, but if we could, maybe 2 or 3 more minutes.
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure.
It seems like you've done a lot of really important and useful thinking about this, though, so I really appreciate this.
Okay, no problem. So I'll shift from Linda's treatment of the successful aging versus something else narrative to Anne, who clearly is addressing it, and looking in the Olive novels, the Strout novels, at this combination of buying into a cultural representation of aging as loss with acceptance of the abilities one has. I think first I want to thank Anne, because I knew a year ago I was going to be commenting on this paper and not the others. So I went ahead and read those books and a bit more of Strout. So thanks a lot. What strikes me about it is that there are so many different ways in which she addresses old age. And so much of it has to do with the different perspectives. It's not just Olive. You go long stretches without any reference to Olive. But there are all of these different people who are somehow witnessing each other age. And it's that sort of shift in perspective that I find really intriguing. The people who leave the post-industrial town, the people who come back, the children, the grandchildren, and so on, and they sort of see each other through these very different lenses. And I think that's a real valuable contribution that Strout has made. There's even the recognition of a changing population and not recognizing the world that's around one, where there are these references to the Somali refugees who are in Maine. And it's something that Strout actually develops much more in other writing. I think finally, Mary, in looking at middle age, is probably, this is sort of the easiest one for a historian to grasp or to comment on. There's this idea that we have to understand the midlife at a time when Germany is existing in midlife. An interesting observation, because often we think of a metaphor of a youthful country or an old country, and it's interesting to have this thing in between. But also the very specific context of people who've lived through the two Germanys. And I just want to make reference something that maybe, Mary, you know about, but there's an article that appeared 2 years ago that I'm going to put also in the chat. It's from December of 2018 in the Journal of Modern History by James Chappell, who's writing on the history of aging in Germany. There's a way in which we can think of what you see in these contemporary writings on middle age in a context, even going all the way back to the Bismarck pensions of the late 19th century. There was a certain way of managing old age. And then there's this experience of the Nazi era, and then there's this bifurcation. And so I really like what you've done with this particularity of aging in East Germany as opposed to West Germany. And there are these different social organizations that exist in East and West. There are different representations that exist in East and West. And I think it would be terrific. You would benefit a bit from the article, but he would benefit from reading you as well. And I'm going to stop there.
Thank you. That was genuinely very, very helpful. Okay.
Thank you very much. I mean, I thought that Linda's and Mary's papers really added important dimensions to our discussions. And Linda, for you, really, I thought what stuck out for me, I mean, was of course Hermann Kinder's drawing ability is exquisite, and the way he uses humor to actually articulate something that is very difficult to deal with, namely this process of bodily disintegration. So I actually think that, you know, Yun Jung Kim's notion of an inhumanist vision fits your model and your text material really, really well. So this management of anxiety by stepping away from the ableism that is so pervasive in the discourse of aging. And to Mary, I wanted to say, I love that trilogy. I think it is wonderful. Share that with you. But I wanted to ask you, don't you think that perhaps the notion of resilience, you mentioned resilience quite often towards the end of your paper, is that not an intrinsically neoliberal, a core neoliberal idea? All the definitions of the neoliberal self emphasize the self's resilience. So from the perspective of disability studies or anti-ableist discourse, they would say you don't need to be resilient. You don't need to be resilient. You can be like Hermann Kinder, dealing with the disintegration of the body in a different way. So that would be my question, because of course we all want to be resilient somehow, but is it perhaps necessary to discard these ableist categories and notions of personhood to advance an understanding of what's happening at the end of the life, which can no longer be described in these terms? But of course you were dealing with middle age. I'm stopping.
I think, can I come in and answer that, Julia? I can.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, Anna. You know, and I think I will probe the term certainly when I expand this, but I think I would historicize the term, because there's no way that resilience, my suspicion is it's been hijacked for a particular contemporary period, and it's the period of neoliberal capitalism. It's a much, much older idea, and Maura absolutely references that with all of her invocations of the asceticism that goes with acedia and so on. These tropes are embedded in the text as well. And while they sort of pertain to the wife who commits suicide, they also extend to the grieving husband through the course of the novel. So I think you would need to historicize it. Even yoga specialists will tell you today that yoga has been hijacked. You know, resilience is such a core thing in yoga. How can we cope? How can we make ourselves function better? Oh, we'll do that lunchtime yoga class that our employer is putting on for us in our shiny offices in Google or wherever it is. But in fact, it's these ideas are much, much older, and they're invariably in their older form spiritual originally, and to do with very sort of focused practices. I think that I would come at that through the historical, but I think you're absolutely right in terms of it being now part of an ableist agenda. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the idea of the choice of the literary form or the artistic form itself having a historical dimension or even a historical critique attached to it is really important. Linda, in your talk, I couldn't stop thinking about Dieter Roth and Martin Kippenberger, you know, and I had a hard time understanding this as a relatively contemporary text. You know, I think it's embedded in history in a way that makes us think about the link between the psychoperceptual and the grand historical narrative.
Absolutely. I mean, Kinder is very baroque in his writing style. You know, you can see that when you actually start looking at the text and taking that apart. He's really interested in those kind of graphic scenes as well, you know, but I think part of what he's playing with in this text is what happens when you write about illness in this way. So he's trying to find a way of discussing illness that isn't sentimental, that isn't playing on pity, but that is actually kind of transforming it in a way. You're talking about kind of the aestheticization of the ugly as well, you know, and his linguistic descriptions really kind of play around with that. There's one where he's talking about a hernia and how this develops, and he describes it in terms of a window cloth, like that kind of a leather cloth, and how that leather cloth through overuse becomes thin, and that's how everything sort of comes out. And this image is like, it's really graphic, it's very disgusting when you read it, but it's also simultaneously very beautiful. And you can see that the drawings are kind of working in a counterplay to that. But I think you're right, like looking at that through a historical frame would be really, really useful as well.
Well, I mean, just going back to Dieter Roth, you know, is he somebody who, you know, this idea of leather or goods or shoe polish or whatever, you know, having being subject to entropy and rot like human flesh, he's a figure, art historical figure for your author who's made those connections between late capitalist accumulation and the body's vulnerabilities.
Yeah. And that kind of idea, the everyday object, you know, that brings it right down for you. Yeah. Yeah.
It's interesting that in my text too, the leaking body plays a significant role. I just didn't have the time to go into these scenes in which Olive experiences incontinence. Yeah. And of course, that's a huge cultural taboo. And that's another crossover to the Kinder. But I wanted to say one of the images where he's kind of hanging there reminded me immediately of the penal colony. Yeah? It's full of Kafka references.
Oh, absolutely. Even in the writing style, of course, you know, he's playing with that boundary between the fictional and the biographical, and, you know, references to Ka, you know, you've got Becht in there as well. You've got, with Koina, you've got lots of things. Yeah.
Aleida wants to say something. I can see a finger raised.
Perhaps just to continue with this, with the leaking body, I think it was in the 80s, there was this debate about the two paradigms, the closed body and the open body. And the closed body was the Winkelmannian sculpture body. So the Greek ideal of the sculpture, white and polished. And the leaking body was the Rabelais or Barthinian body, and that was already introduced as a counter model, and it was very important in the whole carnivalistic code developed at that time. I think it can be brought back to some extent, but there's also a difference, and I would like to emphasize another point that Anne made, which I found really illuminating, because when we talk about age, there's always this idea of transformation. There's a transformation going on. And by bringing in Kafka, we learn to address this transformation as a metamorphosis, which is a totally different thing. And I think that also speaks to Kinder, because this is a totally metamorphized body. It's become strange through the metamorphosis. And I think this is also a trait that is in many Kinder texts, because he's always open for alterity. And in this case, it's the body that becomes the alterity. But it can also be the family history or whatever. There's also always something that is not integral to what he is, or it cannot be made integral.
I think this idea of metamorphosis is an alternative to this, let's just call it neoliberal notion of transformation in terms of positive aging and so on. That's exactly what I was after with this inhumanist position pitched against ableist discourse. And Kafka is, of course, a wonderful example in this regard. Together with Rabelais, one could take it back to the Bakhtinian tradition. And that shows that literature adds another, offers another lens onto the aging process to, say, the gerontological or sociological perspectives.
I think for humane reasons, I should still provide time for a break here. So there's a lot of enthusiasm here for the leaking body and so on, but we're going to have to take a break.
I'm looking forward to our second session with 3 papers. The first one to go is Aleida Assmann, who will present on wisdom, a new concept for gerontology. We're very much looking forward to your paper, Aleida. We're glad you're here.
The next slide, please. Yes, let me start with an example. In an interview recently, the pop musician and painter Wolfgang Niedecken, born 1951, was asked the other day to comment on the title of his last album that had been released under the title Everything Flows. The interviewer mentioned that this motto goes back to Greek sage Heraclitus and an ancient tradition of wisdom. He wanted to know, how about yourself? Have you gained any wisdom of age? And this is what the musician replied. I don't know about the wisdom of age. Of course, one has picked up 1 or 2 things in life. I no longer jump on a table. Instead, I walk around the block and try to reflect. Indeed, everything flows. I see the world now in a much more relaxed attitude. This interview for me is an example how easily wisdom and age are coupled today in our general perception. And I take this now as a starting point for my contribution to connect the two, to raise a few questions. What is exactly meant by this? How is it framed in different culture? And most importantly, of course, how is wisdom today related to age and aging? Instead of giving you my history of this topic, and there is a story to tell, I'm just showing you a book. And I asked you for the next slide. This is the book. And it came out in 1991, so quite a while ago. It brings together various views of wisdom. It's called Weisheit, wisdom. There are various views of wisdom, both historical and contemporary, from different disciplines and cultures, including India, China, Africa, and what have you, showing that in spite of the variegated accesses and terminologies, there might be something like a trans-cultural norm, or at least an ideal of wisdom running through all cultures. This volume, and this is why I'm bringing it up, caught the attention of Paul Baltes and Ursula Staudinger. And here you have the couple, Baltes, Margaret and Paul Baltes, 2 leading German gerontologists who worked empirically on the concept of wisdom in relation to age in the frame of lifespan psychology. In the 1990s, we met various times at the Max Planck Institute for Bildungsforschung in Berlin, of which Paul Baltes was a director, and discussed possibilities connecting and aligning our different approaches. For me, this was a unique experience and a really serious and rewarding interdisciplinary connection between the humanities and the natural sciences. And our workshop today gives me an opportunity to recover now this story for me today and to update some of this research and the ideas on the topic after almost 3 decades in a totally new, inspiring context of your webinar on framing aging. And I'm thankful to be part of this. Now, wisdom, I would like to argue, is inherently interpersonal, creating links of understanding and value, approval and estimation between human beings. It is a concept that is highly valued in all cultures and extends beyond other forms of professional or special knowledge and experience. Wisdom, as I showed in my earlier research, is historically varied and culturally polymorphous. As the value of the system of Western culture privileges youth over old age, rupture over continuation, revolution over tradition, and the future over the past, it has not developed a high regard or standard for the last phase of life as a generator of wisdom. This lost tradition of wisdom was rediscovered, however, not only by me in 1991, but also empirically 1 year earlier by psychologists Margaret and Paul Baltes. 1 year earlier, they had published their book entitled, and this is a running gag, the title comes up again and again, but maybe they were the first. It was called Successful Aging, Perspectives from the Behavioral Sciences in 1990. Their book is rightly considered a milestone because they initiated a paradigm change, as I would like to call it, in the study of psychological aging research. In order to appreciate this paradigm change, we first have to understand how their approach of aging differs from the one that was in place before they came in the mainstream psychological analysis. Now, in the evolutionary perspective of the 1970s, with the last stage or wisdom was hardly ever mentioned at all. The idea that prevailed was a continuous mental growth as a backbone to personal development. And the key concepts here came from Lawrence Kohlberg, who introduced a very influential schema consisting of 6 developmental stages of moral development. I give you here various schemes. They all represent the same model. This model was highly influential also for other disciplines and eagerly picked up by sociologists and philosophers like Habermas, because it expressed neatly the basic principle of Western modernization theory. Kohlberg's schema constructs a line of progress proceeding from egotistic to in-group norms to embracing universal principles. The last stage is called the post-conventional phase. But wisdom lies out of the frame of these 6 categories. It would have to be added as a 7th stage that Kohlberg, however, envisioned only as a very vague speculation, calling it the post-conventional stage. The paradigm change in the psychological approach to which I want to draw your attention here breaks exactly with 2 mainstream ideas, namely that individual psychic development is either a continuous mental or moral progress, or that it is an irreversible process of diminishing capacities. The new approach introduced by lifespan psychology changes many of the leading premises, and now we go back to the next, this approach changes many of the existing premises. And I list a couple of the new questions and answers. The first is that the period of old age needs to be put into the perspective of the whole lifespan. But this lifespan is not a continuous line. On the contrary, any phase of individual human development is characterized by specific challenges and accompanying it by gains and losses. The second assumption is that the new approach started to look empirically also for positive developments, which had not been done so far. In this context, they identified resources that help elders to compensate for capacity losses and optimize their living conditions. This was the special focus of the work of Margret Baltes. In her experimental gerontological work between the 1970s and 90s, she discovered evidence for cognitive learning capacity among the elderly. Even before the neurosciences peaked due to the new technology of the MRI around 2000, she could already show that aging is not a physically determined regressive process, but one that can be actively shaped and supported due to the remaining high plasticity of the brain in old age. Paul Baltes, on the other hand, was interested in wisdom as a dimension that could be implemented into his gerontological research. In probing the concept from the point of view of the psychologist, he broadened his conceptual and methodological frame and opened a door for an interdisciplinary research contact with me, which I found very inspiring. Baltes was certainly aware that we do not grow wiser when with the same irresistible logic that we grow older, but he paid careful attention to the possibility of broadening and reframing the last phase of lifespan with the help of the concept of wisdom. Scholars of lifespan psychology use the term life event determinants in order to point to generic biographical challenges and age-specific horizons of possibilities, tasks, and challenges. While the generic challenges of maturity are reproduction, upbringing of children, and professional life, including, of course, the question how to combine these tasks in a gender equitable relationship, the generic challenges of old age are the waning of influence of power, of skills and strength, together with the imminence of death, all pointing to limitations of former potentials. Looking especially at this third stage after youth and maturity, that is approximately the period between 65 and 80 and more years, Paul Baltes and his colleague Ursula Staudinger focused also on the social and emotional competence, on historical and life experience, and the ability of pointed use of resources. So they used the term of resources here. They found that elderly people not only master their lives successfully, that was the successful aging concept, but that they have a positive impact on society. They have an impact on society and continue developing as personalities. That was their main concept idea. According to them, wisdom is generated in dealing with difficult questions concerning planning, shaping, and evaluating what is considered a good life. They therefore consider wisdom a highly valuable and complex form of knowledge that is needed when dealing with practical dimensions of existential questions. To further qualify this complex form of knowledge or competence, they offer 5 categories, such as mature knowledge of life, lifespan contextualization, relativism of values, recognition, or dealing with uncertainty. For both of them, wisdom is a specific form of knowledge in which intelligence and personality interact. This is important. Intelligence and personality come together here. Yet they don't see age itself as the third element in the process. In other words, for them, as empirical scientists who pursue a strictly cognitive approach, wisdom is something that can be generated in youth or mature age just as well as in old age. Or to make their point even more explicit, age does not produce a disposition to wisdom, but it can be a context in which it appears and is manifested. In conclusion, I want to just point to 6 very, very short elements of wisdom or descriptions. Next, please. Next slide, please. Yeah, it's very important. I just paraphrase briefly that wisdom is the opposite of science, and science being the ground or foundational basis of Western civilization, wisdom, of course, is a marginal and forgotten issue, and we have to recover this history in order to make sense of the whole approach that the Baltes introduced. Second, progress or transformation. Wisdom is generated certainly not through progress, but through a transformation due to a shift in perspective. It is always focused on the present. It's not dealing with the past or anticipating the future, but making sense of a present that is certainly not only the present moment, but a larger sense of presence. Wisdom is a form of knowledge that transcends binaries. It is interactive and culturally framed. That is a form of knowledge that is not universal, but I would call it transversal because it's manifest in all cultures. And lastly, age is a favorable but not a necessary condition of wisdom. And here comes my brief conclusion. As difficult as it is to define wise behavior, as easy is it to define the opposite. Given old and new standards of what is considered wise, Donald Trump can serve as a paradigmatic model of what is considered unwise and foolish. A strong narcissism, a desire for instant applause and gratification, and a concern strictly limited to one's own desires and needs. The fact that this model had been legitimized and supported publicly and globally in the United States for 4 years and still is, shows that Western norms and values still privilege and desperately hold on to the pole of the big ego rather than the pole of wisdom and the notion of a common good. But the negative example of Trump was also hugely instrumental for the concept of wisdom to reappear and to gain more ground, I hope. It certainly shows that age is no guarantee for attaining wisdom, but it also does not refute that position. Given the expanded definition that I have offered, I think that we may safely include age now into the formula given by the Baltes and say that wisdom is an interaction between intelligence, personality, and age. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aleida. Without much ado, we're going to straight on to Jaina Boujalo, who is a PhD student at the University of Bern, who I met in Berkeley a couple of years ago. And we engaged in lots of interesting conversations, so I invited her to participate in our series. So over to you, Zainabu, Aging in Diaspora.
It's a great honor that I take the baton from Aleida, with whose work on memory I engage with a lot in my current research project that deals with diasporic consciousness as it concerns Afro-Brazil. I'd like to thank the organizers of this conference for having me, of this webinar, and thank you so much, Anne, for inviting me to be a part of it. It's been quite a very meaningful webinar and a remarkable journey thus far. My presentation today sets out to show the different strands of research I carried out in developing We Take Care of Our Own, a theatre play I finished sometime last year. I began sketching the basic ideas of the play at the Camargo Foundation in Cassis as part of the Cultural Diaspora Residency, and the subject matter of the play is Aging in Diaspora. In the play, we encounter 3 first-generation immigrants, ages 91, 89, and 87, who are torn between romanticized imaginaries of aging and the realities of living in a nursing home somewhere in Europe. They ruminate on the crude disruptions of intergenerational practices through their own choices to migrate from their homelands for different reasons. Some of these practices could still be carried on, irrespective of geographical location, but on the whole, a collective, however small in number, is required for the performance and transmission of such practices. The characters, established figures in their past professions, a filmmaker from South Korea, an astrophysicist from Senegal, and a chemist from Albania, reminisce over professional achievements but suffer existential anxieties at the dusk of their lives in so-called foreign lands, even worse for them in an institution. According to the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, as of September 2019, the number of international migrants was 272 million, outpacing the growth rate of the world's population. Consequently, there are 220 million first-generation migrants around the world. That's a whopping 40% of the world's population. In another survey carried out in 2018 by the research group Aging in Time of Mobility at the Max Planck Institute for Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity in Göttingen, Germany, it shows that the world is shifting drastically towards older populations, with the number of older persons aged 60 years or over expected to more than double from 901 million in 2015 to over 2 billion in 2050 globally. So what are the implications of such rising numbers of the percentage of older diasporic populations? In what ways do the aging processes differ from other populations within that age range in their own homelands? We take care of our own, sought to bring aspects of diasporic gerontology to the theatre stage. Slide, please. First off, it feeds off my recurrent question: how long does it take a diaspora to cease becoming one? Perhaps it's important to first begin with the changing connotations of that diaspora. A dispersal from an ancestral homeland, a collective memory about the homeland, a feeling of not fully integrating within a host community, a yearning for a return to the homeland, maintaining an image of the homeland, maintaining individual or collective relations with the homeland. These beg the questions: what other than geographical displacement, voluntary or enforced, constitutes diasporic or individual groups, wherein the diasporic individual or group is always conscious of a dislocation and struggles with the sense of belonging and never fully blending in with the host community. From its etymology, diaspora, a scattering, to attempted descriptions by Judge Shepperson, William Safran, and Judge Cohen, among others, convey a consciousness of displacement laced with a longing for a return to the homeland. Slide, please. Stuart Hall, on the other hand, discards conventional meanings of a scattered community with a yearning for a homeland. He writes, and I quote, "I use this term metaphorically, not literally. Diaspora does not refer us to scattered tribes whose identity can only be secured in relation to some sacred homeland to which they must return at all costs, even if it means pushing other people into the sea. This is the old, the imperializing, the hegemonizing form of ethnicity," end of quote. Hall is of the opinion that diaspora can also be defined in terms of a politics of position, which has no absolute guarantee in an unproblematic, transcendental law of origin. For Black diasporic groups specifically, Hall identifies a continuous reinvention, transformation, and becoming that are constantly weaving new narratives of selfhood through creolizing impacts from Europe, Africa, and the rest of the world in their quotidian lives and practices. Another position is held by James Clifford, who looks through the lens of transnational networks when he contends that diasporic cultural forms couldn't possibly be exclusively nationalist in practice. In tune with Hall's notion of hybridization, diasporas are enmeshed in transnational linkages through multiple attachments of which, and I quote, "they encode practices of accommodation with, as well as resistance to, host countries and their norms. Diaspora is different from travel, even though it works through travel practices, in that it is not temporary. It involves dwelling, maintaining communities, having collective homes away from home. And in this, it is different from exile, with its frequent individualistic focus," end of quote. Relocation and mobility continue to be significant aspects of human experience around the globe, with the continuous border crisscrossing for innumerable reasons. Attempts at defining the diaspora have over the years expanded to accommodate many strands of mobility and the rationales behind them. Once upon a time, the term diaspora was a historically and politically encumbered concept. For political theorist William Safran, it appears that diaspora, formerly an object of suspicion, has become one of fascination. Defining diaspora under one rubric will certainly not do justice to the different historical conditions of some groups. New social configurations emerge with global migration and the aging population who engage with newer kinds of social diversity. Slide, please. I return to my research for We Take Care of Our Own, which examines patterns of aging away from the homeland, whose characters understand aging in culturally specific models in terms of care in old age. They understand it as a responsibility, not transferred to formal care facilities, but carried out by immediate or extended family members. The particularities of aging in diaspora, according to Melrose Stewart, a health and aging well enthusiast, are such that, and I quote, aging diasporans are already set on a downward trajectory of unhealthy aging. Social injustice, racism, and ageism are added to their constant battles. Here she refers specifically to the diasporans of the Windrush era of between 1945 and 1972, where a good number of the diaspora are left with fading or no ties at all to the countries of their birth and have their lives firmly rooted in the UK. With the play, I adopted anthropological research methods, mainly observation and interviews. There is also a very impressive body of literature on aging and a handful related to the diasporic condition. I culminated some of the shared aspects of aging in diaspora that perturbed some of my respondents as follows. Slide, please. The loss of or having no sense of home in terms of structure inhabited by loved ones, losing control over their mental and physical well-being, being secluded from practices such as everyday ceremonies, baptism, marriages, birthdays, and the likes. And then a growing need for religion from which they were somewhat disoriented in their more active years, a growing need to believe in some transcendental or immanent being. The character Bajran, who is atheist, suddenly wants to become baptized one more time just because one never knows. There's the fear of dying in a foreign land and increasing vulnerability and the feelings of marginalization and loneliness. Slide, please. When Monsu can finally articulate his feelings, he asks, and I quote, "Does the end not matter more than the beginning? Of what use is a good beginning? If the end is solitary, what is a good beginning? What would have been a bad beginning? To stay back, where like elephants we exit with communal support, where loneliness does not choke out what is left of my mortality." There is not enough time to talk about my conversations with the families from Albania and Turkey living in Switzerland that I had interviewed while on my research, so I'd just skip that part. But these families believe that a nursing home is not an option for their elderly. As one of the women told me, you know, aging is no joke. People die from loneliness. The character Bajran ponders, and I quote, "In the land of my father, I'll be encircled by my offspring. I'd have a special soft carpet beneath my feet. My grandson would massage my feet with eucalyptus oil. They'd pay attention just like I did with my own Baba Gish. I'd clean out his pipes and refill the tobacco. On the terrace where we ate, I would watch how fresh figs got in between his dentures. His eyes always held something called contentment. My eyes missed that," end of quote. In another line, he laments over the redundancy of his memories that need to be transmitted to someone who really understands. Aleida Assmann refers to this kind of memory as active memory, That is, what a group, in this case a family, consciously selects and maintains as salient and vital items for common orientation and shared remembering. In Bajran's words, and I quote, "My memories would remain mine to remember." I think that's one slide more, maybe. Yeah. "My memories would remain mine to remember, to laugh or cry about. This here is all superficial. You really think I'm interested in your stupid dragonflies or Yusuf's stars? Hell no, hell no. This is the phase for contemplation, for pondering and processing, for remembering the bag of memories I have accumulated, for sieving through those I want to keep, telling them to someone who bloody understands, who will retell the others, and those others would genuinely understand. Not this, not this." Slide, please. In Senegal, Majet, as older adults are referred to in Wolof, are often revered and celebrated as in many traditional African communities. There is often an array of vernacular terms that accentuate their value. Within their families and their social groups, the aging population are regarded as guardians of collective memory. In such context, there is an implicit understanding in terms of care, that the younger generation take on the role of caretakers. The character Yusuf construes old age as a time for dutiful preparation for imminent death, during which there's a quest for a renewal of relationship with God. He considers this a time for asceticism, even as a series of events in his past haunt him. Yusuf gets deeply connected with Touba, a holy land in Senegal he considers home. For a majority of the aging Muslim populations in Diaspora I conversed with, it is not so much a fear of dying outside of the homeland, but that the possibility of a funeral, according to Islamic rites, would be very slim. Other religious activities such as collective prayers and fasting with the Eids, Eid al-Kabir, Eid al-Fitr, feasts are actually very successfully observed in Diaspora. But here in a nursing home, Yusuf is disconnected from both the homeland and his own religious community. Slide, please. The character Monsu, who probably fled his homeland of South Korea, is tormented by the perpetrator's memory, whose failed attempt at repressing or forgetting has caused him to be on the verge of losing his mind. He remembers natural elements linked to his homeland, the river, the seagull, insects, sounds and smells. How is it that his bouts of sensory memory are so strong? His friends in the nursing home assume that he's already going mad. Amongst the Korean diaspora, the article "Who Wants to Enter Long-Term Care Facility in a Rapidly Aging Non-Western Society, Attitudes of Older Koreans Towards Long-Term Care Facilities" suggests that traditional norms in many Asian countries, such as familialism and filial piety, have contributed to a general reluctance to long-term care and served as a major barrier to service utilization. Moving into nursing homes is linked to a decline in numbers of family members who are available to offer such services, and adapting to a new environment prompts a disconcerting emotional change that disrupts the flow of daily activities and social networks. Remembering, according to Emily Keightley, is not just an enunciation of individual psychologies, but a performance rooted in lived contexts. Choosing to converge characters from far-flung cultures and belief systems and values was not in a bid to highlight their differences, but rather the commonalities they share as three elderly people haunted by their non-transmittable memories in a nursing home. They share an overwhelming horror of the reality of a nursing home being their final homes, In the words of Aleida Assmann again, we have to rely on memory because it is part of what makes us human. With nagging, unpleasant memories, the act of remembering becomes a torturous expedition for each one of the characters. Nonetheless, they make concerted efforts towards forging new social relations and by reframing what it means to age outside of their homelands while sieving through particular memories they'd like to keep. So finally, to the play's execution, having worked with age-appropriate actors in the first formal outing in the summer last year as directed by Carlisle Brown, it was really quite rewarding. It certainly wasn't the easiest task to sit through hours of rehearsals. These rehearsals were also processes where actors took breaks to share some of their own memories and experiences. So far, the reception of We Take Care of Our Own makes it more evident that issues of gerontology as it concerns the diaspora are becoming more and more urgent. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thanks very much. Obviously, we'll come back to the papers later on, but let's go straight away to Gillian Pye, our last presenter for today, my colleague from UCD. She's going to talk about happiness as emotional experience and narrative process in literary accounts of old age. Gillian.
Thanks so much, and thanks very much for the invitation and for all the work organising this, keeping us all going. I really appreciate it. The background to this paper is my interest in happiness and well-being as manifested in a contemporary happiness industry. Of course, philosophical interest in what makes a satisfying life goes back at least to antiquity, but this issue has never been more dominant than it is today. The role of data in understanding human behaviours, the impact of health technologies, the changes wrought by the digital revolution, and globalisation, concerns about the human impact on the environment, these have all given new meaning to the quest for well-being. And today, governments measure social success by means of World Happiness Reports and the World Happiness Index. Many large employers offer well-being initiatives, and indeed, UCD Wellbeing Hub was launched this month. A tsunami of popular books and magazines promise to help individuals find their way to happiness. Although there's no doubt that high levels of well-being are desirable for societies and for individuals, as Will Davis, Sarah Ahmed, Rob Bodis, and many others have pointed out, as a technology of the self, well-being can be coercive when aligned to neoliberal goals of efficiency and productivity, and to a dubious notion of agency that makes the individual responsible for effective self-regulation and self-authorship. I'm not so much interested in what happiness is as in what it does. How does this powerful technology of the self shape the social imaginary? How does it impact on discourses of self and other? And in today's paper, I just want to consider older age as reflected in literary narratives as a particularly interesting lens through which to explore some of these questions. You will have noticed already that I've been using several terms interchangeably, namely happiness, life satisfaction, and well-being. And the reason for that is because this is actually often the case in current literature on the topic. This is part of a long debate, much of which is centered on the relationship between embodied pleasure on one hand, and on the other, the evaluation of life as successful and satisfying. The use by contemporary psychology of classical Greek terms hedonistic to refer to feelings of happiness and eudaimonic to denote happiness as considered satisfaction underscores that this dichotomy is ongoing. Currently, the convention is to reconcile the two in the concept of subjective well-being, which is defined as, quote, a combination of positive affect and general life satisfaction, end quote. Subjective well-being is perhaps a neat response to the multidimensional nature of the phenomenon, but it's underpinned by the problematic idea that, quote, happiness is a positive emotional state that is subjectively defined by each person, end quote. And typically, scientific research into subjective well-being relies on individual self-reporting. However, if we can understand ourselves as happy, then something shapes this understanding, namely a social and cultural imaginary, powered by scripts and fed by a range of narratives. Increasingly, it's recognized that understanding what happiness does involves interrogating the relationship between emotions and narrative processes. And for this reason, as literary specialists, we ought to be interested in happiness. If we've not been interested, it's because we've been more concerned perhaps rightly, with suffering and exclusion, we've been wary of trite happy endings and ignorant bliss. And I'm not suggesting that literary scholarship should turn away from unhappiness, but rather that it's worthwhile exploring the powerful discourses of happiness and well-being, perhaps precisely because of the way they're implicated in exclusion and in suffering. An interest in well-being is central to notions of positive aging and to a holistic approach to older age that looks beyond physical decline and values the whole of the life course. Older age offers a really interesting test case for thinking about happiness because it sharpens the focus on the relationship between physical experience and life narrative. International research has also reported that individuals experience U-shaped happiness trajectories. Subjective well-being dips in middle age, but generally rises as people get older, thus undermining the commonly held belief that well-being is simply and directly related to the physical peak of youth. Furthermore, the experiences of those living with dementia raise important questions about the extent to which coherent narrative is necessary for flourishing. Questions about how well-being might be related to questions of agency and about how we communicate and share happiness with one another, particularly across generations. And all of this shines a critical light on narrow notions of well-being aligned to neoliberal ideals, which privilege the capacity to function efficiently, to contribute to society, and to exercise autonomy. Particularly because they offer meta-perspectives on the issue of narrative and the individual experience of emotions, literary texts can offer interesting insights into these questions of home and happiness, intergenerational concepts of well-being and happiness, and the relationship between well-being and physical and mental agency, all figure strongly in contemporary novels and stories centered on older age. In their recent volume, Care Home Narratives, Sally Chivers and Ulla Kribenegg explore the nursing home as, quote, a cultural repository for fears and hopes about an aging population. And Paul has obviously written on this topic too. They show how literary narratives set in care homes are an important and increasingly common vehicle for exploring social and cultural anxieties associated with well-being and age. This is an international trend, and in the last part of my paper, I just want to make a few remarks drawn from my reading of some European novels. As far as I know, these are not yet translated into English, but I'll just give English translations of the titles here for speed. So the novels include Victor Hugo Mai's The Spanish-Making Machine from the Portuguese, Camille Peretti's We Will Grow Old Together from the French, and Jens Schwarschuh's Life Takes a Long Time, and Annette Paint's House of Tortoises, both from the German. All of these texts reflect the care home as a place where conventions of happiness and well-being are challenged, but might also be critically renegotiated. In their portrayal of the experience of aging in the care home space, these novels all emphasize the performative aspect of happiness. They cast a satirical glance at the way in which this is reflected in the physical space, observing the way in which accessories such as wall art or furnishings communicate homeliness, but inevitably jar with the ugly and practical necessities of care. The novels show visitors, staff, and residents consciously performing cheeriness for one another. In all of the novels, institutionalized happiness is revealed to be rather coercive, as elderly residents are expected to join in the performance. In Schwarschuh's Life Takes a Long Time, for example, an elderly lady's sudden memory of expulsion during the war threatens to undermine a lively group activity on the theme of food. She is swiftly silenced with the advice that this will be saved for another activity specially devoted to the theme of flight and expulsion. This comic scene deploys memories in an active performance of well-being, but this is at odds with both personal feelings and the life narrative of the individual. In Victor Mai's text, the central figure Antonio, who is moved to a care home after the death of his wife, refuses to play along with the imperative to be happy. Here he invokes the power of the killjoy as a means to resist implication in a fantasy of well-being, a public performance to preserve order. As the doctor in Mai's text tells an elderly resident, your only job now is to be happy and enjoy life, revealing the care home as a space of ambivalence in a complex discourse of well-being. For the middle-aged visitors in these novels, it can exacerbate anxieties about failing to live a happy and fulfilled life. For others, it seems to offer a space of shelter from the demands of the outside world. In either case, aging is revealed in its entanglement with a social imaginary of happiness as a technology of the self, which involves measuring and controlling effective performance. In all the novels, performing happiness underpins family and personal relationships. A genuinely felt desire for the well-being of a loved one is shown to exist in a delicate balance with the need for and expectation of a performance of happiness that ensures mutual stability. In Annetta Payne's novel, for example, a woman tries to entertain her mother with a bird table. Her frustration is matched only by that of the elderly lady who hates it, but cannot speak and is forced to sit and look at it. In Camille Peretti's text, this painful charade is taken to further extremes. A lady who has dementia believes that her husband is actually her lover. He who adores her and likens his first kiss with his wife to winning the lotto must play along with her imagined illicit bliss in order to ensure some sense of stability. Undermining a dominant discourse of happiness as effective performance and as manifested in a harmony with self and other, doing happiness is revealed as fundamentally asymmetrical. This asymmetry is exposed particularly in intergenerational relationships in which partners not only have profoundly different historical experiences and thus expectations of happiness, but are also perhaps unable to perform emotions in a mutually intelligible way. In the example from Annetta Payne's novel mentioned above, the lady whose daughter brings her the bird table wants to show her that she recognizes her daughter's tiredness and frustration, but when she tries to signal this, her daughter mistakes it as a sign she's thirsty. All of these novels reflect in some way or other the need for coherent life narrative in the experience and performance of well-being. In Jens Sparschu's comic novel Life Takes a Long Time, the central figure Titus Poser is a small-time newspaper editor and journalist who loses his job after German reunification and finds alternative employment with a company specializing in producing biographies of ordinary people, printing small vanity editions for the elderly to gift to their family and friends. The business feeds on a contemporary culture in which personal narratives and life satisfaction are part of visible public performances, for example, in social media and reality TV. Titus has established good relations with the old Ferry House nursing home, which he visits regularly to drum up business. This novel, like Sparschu's earlier work, The Indoor Fountain, reflects on well-being as it is negotiated in the space between embodied experience, the need for coherent life narrative, and the pressure for declarative well-being in performances of self-optimization. In one scene, an elderly lady proofreads her biography and does not immediately recognize that Titus has actually given her someone else's manuscript, and the story is not even hers. Indeed, she's initially very pleased with it. This is echoed by Titus's hapless colleague, Schulze, who copies and pastes between biographies, insisting that his cliched formulations are what makes his text comprehensible to their readers. For the ordinary person, at least, an independent self-evaluation of life well lived is shown to be heavily dependent on dominant cultural scripts, repeated and reworked, sometimes into meaninglessness. But Titus's encounter with the enigmatic former museum curator Dr. Einhorn, an expert on the poet and botanist Adalbert von Chamisso, gives him the opportunity to reconsider the experience of future and past horizons and the role of narrative in a sense of agency and life satisfaction. Titus's own unhappiness rests on his difficulty making sense of his own life, but his work with Dr. Einhorn decenters his focus. In particular, he realizes that assimilating individual experiences into a homogeneous and coherent whole under the pressure of dominant scripts tends to involve giving the self a starring role, rather than the more realistic position of supporting role or bit part. Instead of conferring agency and coherence, casting the self in the lead role can actively undermine well-being. With this realization comes a sense that the self is perhaps not the place where well-being occurs at all. And that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your three smashing papers. Now, because of time economy, I'm afraid I'm going to hand over to our respondents immediately, but I'm going to ask you to perhaps just pick 2 points in 2 minutes each, so that we have some time for discussion.
Wisdom, diaspora, and happiness. I thought these 3 papers fitted together really, really well. So my responses are as an ignorant social scientist, and a gerontologist. So what I thought was absolutely fantastic, and it resonates with the last panel as well, was really this sense of the embodiment of aging. And this is what all our literary scholars always bring increasing our understanding of things. I thought in terms of the first paper, I had some questions around, traditional societies and the idea of disengagement, because we're always very hard on successful aging and positive and active aging. But then when we think of what came before it, you know, it really reminded us of that, and how difficult it can be to have any kind of a clear imagination. And I thought as well that the point that you made, Aleida, about Trump was really interesting. But I don't really agree. I mean, I do agree that Trump is an unwise human. And he's a very good example of how you don't necessarily acquire wisdom with age. But his election is a lot to do with the structural changes of the time, particularly the effects of the economic crisis on the democracy in America, and also in terms of the fragmentation of political discourse through the use of social media like Twitter. There's been really interesting work done by media studies scholars on that. So yeah, he's a great example, but it's a bit like using Hitler, really using Trump these days, I think. He's such a kind of an over-the-top kind of example of things. Zainabu, I loved your paper. I absolutely thought I had one really key point, which was this searching for home that you're getting across in your play, you know, that there's so many different kind of disconnects in that, because for the men that you're representing, that they have lived to these ages of 91, 89 and 87, and they're searching for a home. And a lot of what they're searching for, a lot of older people would search for. You lose that sense of home if you move to a nursing home anyway. But I'm also wondering whether they have rose-tinted glasses. Would they have even lived that long if they hadn't been diaspora? It's a big question in Ireland all the time about people who move to America. You know, would they actually ever have lived that long? And then the last point on happiness in Gillian's paper, and what really kept coming into my mind was Anne's paper about Olive Kitteridge, who I absolutely love. And I was wondering, is Olive happy? Is Olive well? Is she experiencing well-being? But the reason we love Olive is because she's happy in her skin. And that, of course, is a good point for me to finish, because isn't that what wisdom is? That you have some sense that you reach the end of your life, that you're actually happy in your skin.
Okay, thank you very much, Gemma. That was very succinct. And then Paul, please.
Yes, thank you very much. And again, these were very, very interesting papers. And to try and boil it down to 2 points is going to be quite difficult. But, you know, coming back to Gillian's piece, I think that what was very interesting there is the idea of, and I obviously I'm going to use the dichotomy between a third and a fourth age. And it seems to be that one of the things that occurs in the fourth age, as I understand it, is the way that they're expected to articulate third age practices. You know, the technologies of the self are ones, in terms of the issue of happiness, that they are continued into the fourth age. So that the emphasis on autonomy, on making meaningful decisions is there, even though there might not actually be the capacity to do so. And I think the second point I wanted to make is in relation to Aleida's discussion of wisdom, because in some sense she draws very much on the work of Paul Balters. But what is interesting in there is that there is an issue about plasticity versus the kind of inelastic nature, or, you know, the plasticity of development rather than inelasticity of old age. And that one of the things that, you know, is interesting is that Balters did actually talk about the fourth age as something that was negative. And I think this is part of the dilemma that comes across in this webinar about how you actually try to not denigrate old age, but at the same time be aware of the limitations that aging and old age bring about. Now, they're not all universal. They don't happen to everybody in the same way, but to actually try and deny them, there's a movement to actually say that a decline narrative is ageist. Well, a decline narrative might be ageist when people are being subjected to it, but to actually deny that there are declines is actually a real problem. And I think this comes back to my biggest point, is that what is the link between culture and the body? And that's in some senses what this webinar is about, but also addressing the fact that we have the lived experience of people, which comes through in culture, in novels, in films, etc., has also got to be in the work that people are doing in the humanities as well as in the social sciences. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. That's excellent. That's again very succinct. You've drawn these papers really well together and raising a few really important issues. So I'm going to ask Aleida, because I know she has to go in 4 minutes, whether you want to respond to Paul's point about the decline narrative, that, talking about decline is not necessarily ageist. It is an observation of a physical process at a certain point in one's life stage. So how would you like to respond?
Yeah, definitely. I would like to respond. I really took you back into the 1970s to 90s. So this was the time before neurology became the lead science, before we had the empirical possibility of imaging how the brain works. So this empirical work, I thought, was important because they already showed that there is still plasticity going on at the time when it was held there would be none. So I think they have to be seen in connection with the developments that came a little bit later. And plasticity is meant in the sense that it enlarges our aging narratives. It doesn't, replace one with another, but it enlarges the scope of our aging narratives. And I also thought it really interesting to hear about happiness and diaspora in the context of wisdom. I thought this was a meaningful constellation because diaspora is also a kind of world in which aging happens. And it also including all material and the way to reassess a life phase is very closely related to this concept of wisdom, but putting it into a really concrete setting. And the same as the care home. I also found this a fascinating context for doing empirical or literary work on this. So I'm very grateful to the other to enlarge my sense of the topic. And Trump, of course, for me, it was a coda. It was just a joke. But I think what it says is that wisdom has to do with thinking beyond the self. And it is really difficult from our Western point of view, with the whole entrepreneurial self-maintenance spirit, it is really difficult for us to think beyond the self. And Trump is really attractive because he is able to do what everybody would like to do for himself. So this was only a caricature, but I think as a negative example, it shows you something about wisdom in a more concrete way. Thank you for your comments.
Thank you, Aleida. And if I know that you have to sign off at some point, so that's fine. Now, can I open it up? I want to thank everybody before Aleida goes for the papers, but can I open it up to some more general comments, trying to pull these various threads together? I think there's been a lot of overlap and of course then divergence as well. So can I invite comments on the papers in this panel?
Can I just make a really quick point, just going back to the Trump thing, is that I actually think there was a latent important point there, which is that in contradistinction to how the successful aging literature that Anna brought up defines old age or characterizes it, this entrepreneurial neoliberal model, the wisdom that Aleida seemed to be describing was this kind of non-purposive, interested in relativity and presentness. It actually was a very kind of anti-capitalist or it was a very different model. And so I think maybe that's actually what the Trump, who's the most pathologically self-interested person, right? It actually highlights the way that your model of wisdom is, I don't know how specifically historically conditioned that idea is, but of resisting purposiveness, resisting self-interest that seems financial as well.
Yeah. Mary has a question. Yeah, and if I don't see you, just speak. It's sometimes very difficult to see everybody. So Mary, yes, please.
Thanks for another great panel. I've been thinking a little bit about that too, and just in terms of trying to bring certain things together. This context of neoliberal capitalism has been sort of there throughout both panels. And of course, Trump is a sort of a grotesque exaggeration of a lot of that. What I wondered is, and I think Aleida, you answered this question anyway, the sort of Hitler-Trump thing, what does wisdom look like in a different political context? What does wisdom look like in fascism, in authoritarianism? is the fascist figure, you know, can they be wise at all? And the response would seem to be that, well, no, if you can't think past yourself, if you can't have consideration and compassion for others, then you know, that sort of excludes wisdom. So, and I think that's plausible. But I had another thought. So in sort of management literature from within the neoliberal sector, there's almost not, you know, it's like as if nothing is left for us. There's almost no free spaces, right? Because managerial literature has also colonized this area of, you know, the wisdom and the compassion, the wise leader, the compassionate leader, the leader who's able to think of their colleagues in a particular way in order to get the team, motivate the team to do things and get better success and meet the targets for the company. And that to me, you know, I think that's very interesting. I mean, I don't believe entirely that something can be that entirely hegemonic, but I do think it's very challenging. It goes back to a core idea of neoliberal capitalism, whereby the economic sphere takes over everything else. It infiltrates culture, it infiltrates personhood, everything. And that's core to the writings of, say, Milton Friedman, the whole idea, of course, culminating in Thatcher's famous phrase, there is no alternative. So you know, what it's like, you know, what aspects are left sort of to individuals. And actually, I think Anna's paper really brought that to the fore, as did Linda's, actually, I think.
Could I make a point?
Of course, Paul, please.
I think that it is worrying me a little bit that everything is conflated with neoliberalism, because neoliberalism is not terribly well defined. It has multiple meanings, but also we have to realize that it also emerges out of the countercultures of the 1960s. The focus on choice, individuality, and not being told what you have got to do is actually a countercultural value. It's not purely a neo-conservative view. And I think that therefore, when we're thinking about aging, those issues that were about the ascription of old age have been challenged by the third age in positive ways. Now, I think that it's a contradictory phenomenon. And I think that if we keep situating it within neoliberalism, I think we lose any kind of real capacity to understand its nuances and its specificities. But just as a point.
And if I can add to that as well, and if you look at what's happening at the moment with the pandemic, you know, that there's been such a collective response to things. And I think it has shown us that as humans, we may have been lambasted by Trump on Twitter for the last 4 years, and that seems to be the zeitgeist. But in fact, look at how we actually behave. One of the big debates has been about intergenerational discord and warfare. And actually, what we've seen is massive intergenerational solidarity, younger people giving up their whole lives and livelihoods to save older people's lives. So I think how we actually live and what the ideology is can be really there's quite a dissonance there. It's a very interesting time to live through, I think, in that way.
Well, I'd like to challenge Paul on the neoliberal side of things, in the sense that, I mean, what you've just outlined is exactly what Luc Boltanski analyzes in The New Spirit of Capitalism, i.e. how countercultural ideas have been absorbed by neoliberalism and integrated into the type of management literature that permeates absolutely everything, and that Mary put her finger on. So, you know, for example, Gillian referred to this well-being website launched by my university, and I had a look at it, and it's an exemplar, a classic exemplar of how well-being is being mobilized in the service of institutional functioning. It's all well-meaning. I'm not saying it's nasty in that sense, but Mary pointed to the absorption of all these categories of well-being by a prevailing neoliberal discourse, which is pervasive. I checked out the titles on aging well. There are thousands of titles on aging well, which have a 7 to 10 step approach or whatever it is, and they're all invested in the successful aging paradigm. It is the prevailing paradigm. It even filters down to healthcare mobilizing us to age well. So,
but it's not working though, Anne. It's not working. If active aging and successful aging as an ideology were working, and Des will come in on this, I'm sure, we wouldn't have such an unhealthy older population, particularly in the UK with the large levels of high mortality rates, is because we don't have a really active, healthy aging. So, I mean, this might exist, but we're not listening to it.
Well, you know, I just want to come
working.
Okay, Mary and then Des, it's getting lively. Okay, Mary and then.
I mean, I take your point, Paul, and of course you are right. You know, the sort of the counterculture of the 1960s and the focus on the individual is it could suit very nicely the neoliberal agenda, which of course is about individualism. It's about, you know, it is about the self being responsible for the self in a sort of a core way. So it touches in on older philosophies in a new late 20th century context. But historically, this neoliberal economics go back to the 1920s, to German Ordo liberalism, and to the Austrian school of the 1930s and 40s, and then the Chicago school of the post-war period. And so this sort of school was working away all the time, and I think there in the background and building up a network, a global network, which really came to prominence with Thatcher and Reagan, and so I mean I agree it's not necessarily a hegemonic takeover, and it might be there in the discourse. It's not necessarily how it trickles down, but it's very influential. It's there.
Oh yeah, definitely it is.
You know, so
okay, let's hear from Des.
Sure. Well, just one point around. I think it'd be very dangerous to. I would be with Paul on this, on not trying to enclose any of this into any particular political ideology. Joe Biden has just appointed to his healthcare team Ezekiel Emanuel, who wrote a really toxic piece in a liberal magazine, The Atlantic, Why I Want to Die at 75, was deeply negative about aging into later life in a way that if he'd done this around race or around gender identity, there would be furore. So this is hugely deeply rooted. I would just like to commend, I think, particularly the focus on through novels and literature. I think what's really important about novels and literature, and as we've heard this afternoon, is the deeply personal, authentic experience. One of the great mysteries of gerontology is that generally people feel warm, positive value around their older relatives, their parents, their uncles, their aunts, their grandparents. And then there's this gulf across to older people, this othering of aging. So I think this has been hugely valuable. And just as a last comment, I think it's really good also to engage with gerontology. I think one of the dangers perhaps of having two separate dialogues is the men of straw that may appear. And I'd like to reassure those in the humanities and arts area is there's actually a very lively discourse challenging successful aging, which was hugely important 20 years ago to challenge a completely dominated decline narrative. But now we are concerned that there may be such a thing as failed aging. So I would just really like to say I feel very enriched by what I've heard. I'd encourage this process to continue. It's been fantastic.
Yeah. And can I recommend one paper in the Journal of Aging Studies from, I think it was about 2014, and I use it as, now I'm going to mispronounce it. It's Bulow and Sudakovist. And I'll just actually put it into the chat.
Put it into the chat if you
can. Great paper critiquing successful aging.
Yeah.
I wanted to say something about Zainabu's paper. Firstly, that this is an anthropological perspective and a project in collaboration with older people who enacted these roles. And of course, it's very important to open up our debate to look at ethnicity as well, because that's something that was mainly absent from the first panel because we all had a similar perspective. So that's a very important point, especially in the context of the Windrush scandal in the United Kingdom and the deportation of citizens who were deprived of rights and actually deported. So thanks very much, Zainabu, for adding this perspective. It's very important. Yeah.
I'd like to kind of back that up, because I was going to say something, but I only had 2 points, because I think that one of the things we also have to realize is that our understanding of the experiences of aging have transformed from when welfare states set up old age pensions where they expected people to be nationally bound and be retired from work. You know, one of the things we haven't really discussed is retirement as the actual real arena in which aging occurs. So that retirement used to be just a kind of antechamber to death. Now it's a significant part of the life course. And as a significant part of the life course, it has all sorts of extra dimensions that need to be thought through. And one of them is migration. And migration isn't just something that happens, to countries. It also happens, with people going to other countries. One of the interesting issues about Brexit coming up on the 1st of January is all those diasporic British people in Spain who actually haven't even bothered to learn Spanish and now have no actual legal rights to stay in Spain. It's an interesting thing that the nation state and retirement went together in the kind of globalized world. It's a much more complex issue, and therefore you have, just as a little anecdote, I was in a research meeting and we were talking about minority ethnic groups, and then people had to start breaking down those minority ethnic groups into, well, in Britain we have East African Asians, people who actually their history over the 20th century at least was in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and who have come to Britain in the 1970s. Now, do you put them with the people from from India and Pakistan, or do you actually make them into a group of them of their own because their culture is slightly different? These are kind of the issues of aging and experiences of aging.
You should try Northern Ireland, Paul, for identity. Can I just come in on one last point as well, Anne, on that?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Gillian made a brilliant argument about now your job is to be happy. I think you were quoting one of the, and I think this is so interesting because it raises the point about retirement. And there's so much evidence now from longitudinal studies in aging that retirement isn't necessarily good for you, particularly if you like your job. And how are we going to negotiate that where we have people who don't want to retire? We need to have jobs for younger people. And there's a whole kind of big social policy argument there as well. But this idea of your job is to be happy, it's just an impossible task.
Yes. Your job and your only job now is to be happy and enjoy life. I think that was the quote, Gillian. Yeah. So I don't want to extend because we're over time already, but I wanted to say one thing about Gillian's paper. I wondered about the category of contentment as an alternative to happiness. Would that not help us to reframe aging? Something to discuss further. I'm sure we can't do it now, but just I was thinking about, as an alternative term, what could you envisage in old age, in the fourth age, a sense of comfort and contentment and relationality. This was my term, in the sense of being embedded in a network rather than this, self that renews itself all the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is I think the really interesting thing about old age and about that kind of, about the transition between the third and fourth ages that Paul was drawing our attention to before, that it kind of really actually stretches a lot of the dominant concepts and asks us to rethink them, asks us to think about agency and happiness as a kind of, I think it's Schmotkin calls it an agentic system, that happiness is this agentic system. And I think it forces us to think about that and to think about to what extent that might relate to things like self-authorship or the way in which we communicate emotions to one another. And contentment would be interesting in terms of thinking about active versus passive, because contentment is kind of quite often thought of as more of a passive stance, I think, a passive mode. And I think that novels like the ones I was talking about really ask us to do that and to think about it in a different way. And this idea of Titus Polzer, the protagonist of the last novel I was talking about, that he kind of realizes that that a decentered focus is a really important way of thinking about his life. And I think that has to do with contentment and with not about working on the self or self-optimizing, but actually looking for well-being in a completely other place.
Yeah. Okay, excellent. Looking at the time, are there any more comments or interventions? It seems to me that there are lots of ideas emerging from this, but I just wanted to say before everybody goes away that we'll have the next webinar on the 22nd of January and then the fourth one sometime in February. But we're currently planning a real face-to-face conference as an exit conference for possibly September 2021, when we all have the vaccine, so we hope.
Yeah.
So and so this means that over the next 6 weeks or so, we need to think about a topic that we want to pick from what we've done so far and to carry it over for a conference topic. And today, two themes have come up. One was the fourth age, actually looking at perhaps the very old age and mortality, might be one possibility, or retirement as an arena for aging, a very broad arena for aging. Just to
or we could just get the gloves off and do neoliberalism, man.
Yeah, we could do that. Mind you, there is a lot of stuff out on liberalism. I think we might use it.
There's a lot of stuff that agrees with each other, though. There's a lot of people agreeing with each other, that neoliberalism is a bad thing.
Well, you see, from our humanities perspective, you're unlikely to get.
No, but it is a bad thing. Believe me, I agree it's a bad thing, but there isn't enough critical discussion about it.
Okay, we'll put it on the list. And anyway,
not going to make it.
If you have ideas, if any one of you has ideas for a conference, theme, a broader theme that's connected with our discussion so far and the two webinars that will follow, please, contact us and write in and send us our ideas. That would be wonderful. So I suppose it behoves me to thank all contributors today, the chairs, the attendees, the discussants, and of course, those who have presented papers, and the respondents who had a tough job, compressing their responses because of time. And as we know, the webinar format always comes with certain challenges. Anyway, I hope it's been a good experience for you, and we're looking forward to seeing you in January. And I wish everybody, together with my other co-organizers and Valerie, I want to thank Valerie and Ricky, especially Valerie, who's prepared all of this. Thanks very much, Valerie, for organizing everything for us. I wish you all an enjoyable, relaxing Christmas period, and that you can all recharge your batteries. Mine are certainly pretty empty now. And we'll resume this conversation on the 22nd of January. So bye-bye from me, and Happy New Year and all that.